Hello again. Welcome to the second screencast for the class Getting Schooled. Section 2 builds on Section 1 in the sense that we're continuing to talk about problems in education. In this section, we'll be getting a bit more into the nitty-gritty of how we can turn education problems into education policies that are meant to address the problems. As a nation, we hear a lot about what's wrong with schools in America. After this section, you should have some ideas about things we can do as citizens to engage in the process and to improve education. The goal of this section, then, is to have you think deeply about a problem facing education and dig in to try to define the problem, gather research about it, and start thinking about policy proposals that can address the problem. I have outlined 6 objectives for this section that are related to that. At the end of this section, students will be able to explore prevalent education issues on the current education policy stage. They'll be able to differentiate between issues regarded as private or family issues and issues regarded as public or societal issues. They'll be able to select an education problem and, using Fowler's process, frame the problem as a policy issue. They'll be able to identify appropriate scholarly research sources like foundations, think tanks, university policy centers, and professional literature, and gather relevant background information to define the problem. They'll be able to identify causes or crucial indicators underlying the issue. And finally, they'll be able to synthesize articles about a specific education issue in an annotated bibliography. So let's get this started by recapping some of those educational issues that we brought up in the first screencast. There is an oft-repeated quote, "Our youth now love luxury. They've had bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for their elders, and they no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents and tyrannize their teachers." Would you believe that this is a quote that's attributed to Socrates? I ask because we think it's a novel thing these days to look at our adolescents and lament the fact that they're poorly motivated, that they're rude, and that they're disengaged and irresponsible about their civic duties. The truth is that people have been looking to schools to address these issues for a long time. Though this is just one issue that the education world faces, it's heartening to consider the fact that we've faced this issue for literally at least 2 millennia. Broadly, Socrates' lament encompasses a concern that kids are unmotivated, that they don't persist in schooling, that they're hyper-obsessed with technology. All of these things are said to impact students' academic achievement, graduation rates, which typically hover in the upper 70th percentile, and college enrollment and persistence. In other words, we expect that 100% of students in the United States should graduate from high school, but the percentage of kids graduating from high school after 4 years just recently reached 80%, and that's a high. Also, there's a lot of pressure to attend college for a certain segment of the population, but the college completion rate after 4 years is only at about 35%. All of these factors impact how the United States perceives children and adolescents, and how well or how poorly the United States does in international academic comparisons. Relatedly, there is an important phenomenon in the United States known as the achievement gap, or the different levels of achievement between different subgroups in America. For example, we now know through a national test called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, that on average, African American 12th grade students read at the same level as white 8th grade students. We also know that by the time children enter kindergarten, the children of professional families have heard 19 million more words than the children of working class parents, and 32 million more words than the children of parents on welfare, contributing to what we call the class achievement gap. We also see similar gaps between males and females in reading and math performance. This demonstrates that there are different academic performance levels for different subgroups in American school systems, and it highlights the fact that there exists massive inequality and opportunity for American youth in schools. We will refer continually to the academic achievement gap in this class, so please make a special note of this concept. Another education issue that you regularly hear about on the national stage and in media is related to teaching and teacher quality. We have a tremendously high attrition rate, or a turnover rate, in the teaching force, where about half of the people who enter teaching leave the profession by the 5th year. You'll also regularly hear the claim that unions are negatively impacting the teaching profession, In their effort to negotiate for better working conditions and pay for teachers, many people claim that unions promote shoddy or weak job performance in our nation's teachers. For example, a recent article in the New York Times makes the claim that teachers' unions prevent teachers from spending more than 3 minutes per parent on back-to-school or teacher conference nights in New York. Other issues in schools that regularly surface in the PDK poll for the American public include funding issues, school climate, and safety issues for children. We need to consider which of these issues the American public believes to be private issues and which issues the American public believes to be public issues. There are many people in the United States who hear about education problems and claim that what children do for 6 to 8 hours a day is a public or a civic issue. Or, for example, when you hear Diane Ravitch or Linda Darling-Hammond talk about the role of schools in America, they'll frequently remind their viewership of their belief that schooling is a public good or a public concern. There are many examples of issues in American education that Americans typically regard as public or civic issues. For example, many believe that it's the public's responsibility to make sure that all children are attending school at least through 16 years of age. Many are concerned about inequitable school finance, graduation rates, academic achievement, civic knowledge, and engagement, and they see these as public issues that all people, whether or not they have children in schools, should be concerned about. Many also believe that children should be in school because it's a social good to have all children, adolescents, and adults in American society have basic academic skills. What do all of these things have in common? The argumentation is that both poorly educated and well-educated children impact society directly. So schooling is a public and social issue. You'll see in the next section of the class that there's evidence to support the idea that political liberals, including those affiliated with the Democrat, Socialist, or Green Party, tend to see all of these as public issues and tend to favor government regulation and interventions to solve these problems. We also need to consider which of these issues the American public considers to be private issues. There are many people in the United States who hear about education problems and claim that what children do at home, and even some of the things that they do at school, should largely be within the purview of parents. What are examples of some of these issues that the American public sees as private or family issues? For many Americans, children's emotional and physical health is seen largely as a private or a family matter. In other words, if children are dealing with a loss like a death in the family, drug abuse at home, or their parents' divorce, this shouldn't be addressed at school. You'll hear the term wraparound, the idea that the school should provide services to address children's emotional and physical health and children's safety within and outside of school. Wraparound services in a school might do vision and hearing screenings, provide free and reduced-priced breakfast before the school day, and even counseling on parenting techniques. We know, of course, if a child is hungry or cannot see the chalkboard, they won't perform as well in school. If a school provides free or reduced lunch, vision and health screening, is that school stepping too far into the realm of what parents should be responsible for? Moving to the next example, what about parenting styles? We know that parents achieve varying levels of educational attainment. Some have not completed high school, while others have. Some have attended vocational high schools, and others have completed academic high schools. Some have attended 2-year college training, while others have completed an undergraduate degree, master's programs, or even doctorate and postdoctorate degrees. What parents are able to model for and advocate for in terms of their children's education varies tremendously depending on how much formal schooling they have completed. Furthermore, parents' education levels impact what is called families' borderline grade tolerance, or the grades that parents allow from children before they get involved. Parents' engagement in the school through organizations like the PTA or PTG and their involvement and persistence with homework, all of these things have been shown to impact children's academic performance in schools. Relatedly, the number of times a parent or guardian brings children late to school, calls them out, absent, or even moves them district to district substantially impacts children's work in school and their academic success. What do all of these things have in common? These things typically vary by socioeconomic status or class and directly impact children's academic achievement in school and economic mobility in our country. However, unlike the problems described in the previous slide, many people see these things as private family issues. That is, there is not as much consensus over the idea that the public or public schools specifically should have a role in solving these problems, People who are ideologically and politically conservative, including those who might call themselves a political conservative, a Republican, or a libertarian, may believe that these things should not be governed. This is an important thing to consider when you're defining a policy issue. Are people generally behind the idea that government has a role in solving this? As you'll see in future sections of the class, just because many people might see this as something private or a family issue, that doesn't stop them from trying to pass legislation or mobilize government forces to address the problem. All of these things you must take into consideration while you're turning the educational problem that you've identified into a policy issue. Before we move on, I'd like to make a note that there are a number of things that Americans now consider problems in American schooling, which are actually offshoots of policy efforts to eradicate problems. So what do I mean by that? Things like tracking, teaching students with disabilities, No Child Left Behind, Student Succeeds Act, the Common Core state standards, and the prevalence of standardized tests are all meant to address problems in public schools. They're not technically education problems in and of themselves, though some of them have emerged as problems. If overtesting and No Child Left Behind or Common Core state standards are problems that you've identified, I encourage you to keep them separate from actual problems. These policy interventions are meant to actually equal the playing field in education and have become problematic over time. Really, at the heart of the problem you've identified is equalizing education quality. Let's keep them separate. This is a complicated point, so let's keep discussing this and certainly be in touch if you're not understanding the distinction that I'm drawing here. Having said that, taking an education problem and turning it into a policy issue requires following a particular process. First, you have to understand that when you convert a problem to a policy issue, you're beginning with the assumption that this is a problem that can and should be addressed by the government. And depending on your political ideology, which we will address in greater detail in the next section, you may or may not believe that the government should be solving problems that are considered private or family problems. However, to a certain extent, most people believe that educational problems can be addressed through good policy. In this section, you have two resources that outline the process of policy formation. The first resource is Norwich University's Characteristics of Good Policy webpage. The second is your Francis Fowler textbook, particularly the chapter called Setting the Stage and Getting on It, Issue Definition and Agenda Setting. Certainly before we move on, I'd like you to put top of mind the education problem that you've identified as being the most important problem facing education today. Now that you've identified your problem, let's start the process of taking that problem and defining it as an educational issue, then taking that issue through the policy process. Okay, so whatever the problem is that you've chosen, it's time to define the problem and begin to shape the problem into a policy issue. Start from the very beginning of this path pictured here. Now, this framing process is taken from Norwich University's site, and it follows very closely how Francis Fowler lays out the policy process in the text. Now, how do you define the problem? First, you'll need to consider who might see this as a public issue and who might see it as a private issue. One of the things that defines a public policy is that it is public, in the sense that it calls on government bodies to address the problem in some way. If it's an issue that's largely seen as a private family issue, consider how you might frame the issue in a way that people understand it as a public issue. For example, you might think of the obesity epidemic and its impact on learning and achievement for children in schools. Perhaps you can frame it as a public issue by discussing related problems like the long-term impact of obese children on the public health system. While some would argue that this is a private family issue, how can you make it clear that this is an issue that the public has a vested interest in addressing? How can you define the problem in a way that merits government action? In other words, let's transform that problem you've identified into a policy issue. Think broadly about what you believe is causing the problem and try to be creative about brainstorming different ways of describing and addressing that problem. What are the things that amplify the problem or make it worse? What are the levers that a government body could pull to mitigate or diminish the problem a little bit? Take a minute, pause this video, and just brainstorm. What things are at the heart of the problem? Really pause here. Okay, now you hopefully have some language and ideas about the different indicators and levers impacting the problem. The next step is to begin to gather evidence about how significant the problem is, its impact on the public, and the various things that have been tried to address the problem in the past. This stage is stage 2, or gathering the evidence. Where do you get the evidence from? In your textbook, Fowler describes a consortium of research bodies and policy centers that work to consolidate information related to education policy issues. In other words, these are people who are paid to look at education problems, turn them into policy issues, and then study the heck out of them. Some institutions, think tanks, policy centers, and research centers that regularly come up in the literature include the Stanford Center for Policy Analysis, Harvard University's Center for Education Policy Research. These two universities both belong to CPRE, or the Consortium for Policy Research in Education. Other think tanks like the Rand Corporation and the Carnegie Corporation, the Heritage Foundation, and the American Enterprise Institute are funded typically by foundations with a particular ideological leaning in terms of the policy proposals. For example, conservative think tanks might encourage policies that remove power from the government, and a liberal think tank might encourage policies that call on the government to address the problem. For our purposes in this class, I will typically ask you to gather evidence from Ed Week, which is a trade magazine that will help you consolidate information and evidence to address these problems from all of the different sources of education research. It's also much more approachable in terms of the readership. It's not laden with technical jargon. So now you have brainstormed how to define the problem and where to gather evidence. When you're gathering this evidence from Ed Week, you'll want to be thinking about identifying causes of the problem. What's causing this problem? What's making it worse? What might alleviate some of the causes? This is different from stage 1 in the sense that you've moved on from brainstorming about the problem to reading about it, gathering evidence, and seeing what other experts are saying about what's causing the problem. Okay, we're going to stop here in the policy process because I'd like you to take just a few steps at a time. For this section of the class, however, your assessment is that I ask you to complete and upload an annotated bibliography. I'd also like you to preview the white paper or policy brief assignment because they are related. The annotated bibliography of your policy issue represents the first steps toward completing a policy white paper on your chosen problem. There are many resources available to you on the web if you type in annotated bibliography, but I also have included 2 short links in our course website so you have ready access to some guidelines to find out the basic components of an annotated bibliography and a white paper. For Section 2, we have explored the beginning stages of Fowler's policy process. Now think about your problem, including what you wrote on the prior knowledge activity. Explore sources like Education Week. You'll see on our course website that there are also documents that outline how to search Education Week through the permalink provided in the document. So this might be a good slide to print out and be sure that you've got a firm grasp on the different concepts embedded in each, sort of like a checklist. So think to yourself, do you understand these concepts? Okay, that's it for this screencast. I said at the beginning that by completing this section, you'll gain mastery over the following objectives. Take a metacognitive moment here and really listen as I read through these objectives. I said that at the end of this section, students would be able to explore prevalent education issues on the current education policy stage. That you would be able to differentiate between issues regarded as private or family issues and issues regarded as public or societal issues. That you'd be able to select an education problem and using Fowler's process, frame the problem as a policy issue. That you'd be able to identify appropriate scholarly research sources and gather relevant background information to define the problem. That you'd be able to identify causes or crucial indicators underlying the issue. And by completing the annotated bibliography, you'll be able to synthesize articles about a specific education issue. Do you feel like you are beginning to master these objectives and that you're ready to move on? If you feel like you're having any issues with or a sense of problem, please feel free to contact me, and I will try to help point you in the right direction to resources that are most likely to get you to mastery with each of these objectives. In the meantime, good luck with your Education Week search and turning your education problem into a policy issue by following Fowler's process and building your first policy white paper. I'll see you in class.